All right, people, welcome to another edition of the Wisdom of the Wilderness. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. Last week I was down and out and I'm still recovering, so I may have to get up and get a drink of water at like 2 o'clock because I still have a really bad sore throat. But I'm glad to be with you. Pretty much haven't been outside in a long time. So let us continue on our journey. And we are at the beginning of chapter 10. And this section is called Natural Being. And it's on page 163 of my book. And there is a quote from St. John of the Cross, as there is for every chapter heading. And it says, "I will head for the mountains and for watersides. I will not gather flowers, nor fear wild beasts." That night in the cabin, as I slept through the rainstorm, I had a dream about a mountain lion. In the dream, I walked out the back door of my house, and there was a high wooden fence around the yard, and the mountain lion was crouched on top of the fence. Children from another yard were yelling and throwing rocks at him. His great gray body was utterly still, except for his long, soft tail swaying slightly and his head turning left and right slowly, simply looking. He looked at the children and then back toward me, his eyes passing over me completely open, seeing me and everything around me, and I was nothing special to him. I sensed no expression on his face, no emotion in his deep eyes, only complete perceptiveness, cat being. A stone bounced off his haunch, and I could see a slight twitch of muscle there beneath
Hold on a
us.
second, Jake. I'm sorry. Can we figure out where that background noise is coming from?
Oh, my wife is just finishing teaching a class for the next 10 minutes, but she's on the other side.
Oh, okay.
It's just like another 10 or 15 minutes, but this is the only place that our computer is working right now.
Oh, that stinks. Okay. Well, I think we can work with it for 10 minutes.
Yeah, it won't be too much longer.
Thanks.
All right. A stone bounced off his haunch, and I could see a slight twitch of muscle there beneath the smooth fur. In the dream, I knew he would move soon. I knew he would not abide the harassment much longer, but he seemed unperturbed, completely calm. I sensed from the movements of his head that he was in no way cornered. His options were wide open. He could attack the children. He could be upon them in one bound. He could leap toward me. He could do anything he wanted from his perch on the fence. I was frightened by his power and his vast possibility, but I was also fascinated by his stillness, how he took his time. I thought he must be deciding what to do, but I knew immediately that decision-making was not happening inside him. What was happening inside him could not be known to me. He stood. He was huge. In one smooth movement, he leaped from the fence toward me, over my head like a gray brushstroke on the sky to the top of another fence behind me and to my left. Tail straight behind him, not looking back, he walked to the end of the fence, jumped down on the grass, crossed the street, and started up a hill toward an old barn. In my dream, I followed him. Compared to his movements, mine seemed erratic, undefined, tentative. He seemed so certain, so sure of himself. Yet I also knew that certainty and self-assurance were not in him. It was something deeper and cleaner, something less complicated and much more powerful. I was far behind him when he reached the barn. I saw him go up some steps and disappear inside. I struggled up the hill and peeked through the door. Inside, the building appeared to be a rodeo arena. No people were there, but there were horses in a central corral, and they were very afraid, whinnying and running back and forth. High above them, the mountain lion was leaping, gliding in graceful arcs from rafter to rafter, In my dream knowing, I was sure he had no hostile intent toward the horses. He was, in his own mountain lion way, playing. Alighting on one beam, he suddenly stopped and turned and looked straight at me. His face was expressionless, but I sensed something in him that, finally, I knew and could understand. It was his enjoyment of the play, his body pleasure in bounding through the air above the horses, and his pure sense delight in their reaction to him, their sound and movement beneath him. I wanted to be just like him then, to feel what it was to be those muscles inside that gray fur and to leap from rafter to rafter above the horses and to simply know what to do, to know so surely what comes next with not a single thought of it. But no, once again, I'd lost touch with him. He doesn't know what comes next. It's more like he waits, is always waiting and watching and sniffing and listening, waiting for what comes next. My dream thoughts had taken me somewhere, and when my gaze returned to the mountain lion, his teeth were bared, his eyes fierce, and he was no longer playing. He leaped toward me from the beam, high over the horses. His great paws puffed the straw and the dry dirt of the floor where he landed, and he came for me. There was no decision-making in me then, nor any self-assurance as I turned and ran toward the door. Yet I ran straight and clean and fast, and I could smell him and feel his presence closing behind me. To my right were 4 planks of barn siding laid across 2 high packing crates, and I jumped up there and stood still. The lion, I knew, could easily have jumped up after me, but instead he stopped beside the crates and just looked up at me. Strange, I thought, that neither he nor I is out of breath. He looked up at me, and I looked down at him, and it lasted quite a while. Then he turned and went out the door. I awoke then and lay for a long time in the blankets in the little brown cabin, my eyes closed. The dream had left a feeling in me, something of animal being, indescribable but sure, delicate in my mind, but certain in my heart. I opened my eyes to the bright New Mexico morning. The storm had passed in the night. So before we move on to animal being, it was interesting in some of these things he's talking about him being so certain, but the certainty and self-assurance were not in him. It was something deeper and cleaner, something less complicated and much more powerful. And so what Gerald May is tapping into here, the mountain lion, like animals in general, have an instinct, an instinctual way of being that's beyond, a lot of times he's saying it's beyond the way that we think of behavior because we're so focused on thought or intellectual activity. But there's a deeper kind of knowing in the animal. And Gerald May wants to get to that deeper understanding and deeper knowing. But I think it's interesting that it ends kind of with the mountain lion kind of jumping up there on these crates and knowing that he's just looking at him. And he says, strange, I thought that neither he nor I is out of breath. He looked up at me and I looked down at him, and it lasted quite a while. And then he turned and went out the door. And the dream had left a feeling in me, something of animal being, indescribable but sure, delicate in my mind but certain in my heart. I opened my eyes to the bright New Mexico morning. It's interesting too, because again, he's writing this book at the end of his life, in a state where he knows he's at the end of his life, where he knows he's dying. And I wonder, I mean, obviously that's going to play a part on an author's feeling and the way that they're relating their feelings, knowing that they're at the end of their life. But this particular passage was really intriguing to me because he doesn't really tell you too much about what he thinks the dream means. He just kind of explains the dream very intricately. and then kind of leaves with the storm passing. But he doesn't actually tell us too much about what he believes the dream is telling him, which I find interesting because in a lot of other parts of the book, he kind of does try to get more psychologically into what he thinks about it. But with this one, he just kind of lets it be, which I find interesting. So anybody else have any thoughts on this dream?
Well, it sounded like at the end, he was looking down at the mountain lion, which would mean it was kind of subdued. He had power over that wild animal.
And then later on, the mountain lion climbs up the rafters over the horses, right?
No, I didn't get to that part.
Well, yeah. So the mountain lion later is jumping on the rafters above the horses, but he says he doesn't really feel that the mountain lion wants to do the horses any harm. He's just playing. It's a fascinating thing, and I've read this part several times over the years, and it's still, every time that I read it, he doesn't give kind of any hints as to, he describes the dream in detail, but he doesn't give us any psychological clues as to kind of what it might mean to him, other than he would like to understand that kind of pure playfulness that the mountain lion feels in that moment. I wonder, as people, I do think that we're capable of pure playfulness, but I think a lot of times it's like somebody who's dancing. Like, you can't dance if you're thinking about who's watching you dance, right? like if you're in your head while you're dancing going, I wonder who's watching me dance, then you're not really dancing as much as you're just kind of a psychology experiment on the dance floor. But when you're actually dancing, you're not worried about if anybody's watching you, right? Because you're in the actual act of dancing. But I wonder how often human beings ever reach that pure place of doing something where their mind isn't questioning the doing of it. You know what I mean? I think that's what he's trying to get at. Like, I doubt a mountain lion says, I wonder who's watching me stalk a prey. He's not in his head, right? He's just stalking the prey. But like with us, even when we're really engaged in something, a lot of times there's still a part of our mind that's watching ourselves do it. And that's why a lot of times Buddhist or Zen teachers will say, you got to get out of your head. But that's a very scary place for a lot of people to get out of their head, because they live most of their life in their head.
Yeah.
So I think kind of he's at the end of his life now. He's been a psychologist, and let's face it, psychologists are very much in your head, not only in their head, but your head too. And so now he's trying to find a way out of his head. It seems like, and this dream is kind of showing him a way to do that. Because remember, a dream is a projection. He's projecting the mountain lion in the dream. So it's like his subconscious is the one creating the mountain lion. So it's interesting. It almost seems like he wants to have a moment of pure being before he dies. Anyway, that's my in my head thought about it.
I've got a question here. Hold on. Here's Joe.
It's meditation. And when I meditate, I'm just totally there. Not worried about anything. But it's for prayer.
Alan, could you repeat that for me? What she said?
When she meditates and she prays, she's peaceful. She's not thinking about other things. Yeah. And I think Patty had something.
I said that's about right.
Oh, she agreed. We got
And so then what's the difference when you come out of that? Can you keep that state in your daily life?
No, but I want to keep that state in my daily life.
Yeah.
But she said no.
Yeah, and that's a really big part of the spiritual path. So I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Razor's Edge. It was a book written by Somerset Maugham, and it was a very popular movie I believe it was the 60s. And in that movie, it's a great book too, but a guy he goes to the war and his friend saves his life, but his friend dies in World War II, saving his life. And so the guy who's the main character, he now believes that he needs to live a life that means something because his friend lost his life so that he could have a life. And he was originally going to go home and marry this very beautiful woman and become like a very successful businessman. You know, he had a job waiting for him, but now he finds that he can't do that because that path was set aside for him, and he finds that that wouldn't be meaningful enough. So he goes to Europe and he works in factories and he consults different wisdom teachers. And then eventually he finds his way to the Himalayas. And he finds a spiritual teacher who puts him up in a little hut way up in the mountains where he can't speak to anybody else. And he's up there for months just by himself. And he gets really, really clear, right? Like he's the clearest he's ever been in his life. And so finally, a few months later, this spiritual teacher climbs up to the hut in the mountain. And the guy says, you know, I feel the clearest I've ever felt in my life. I just want to stay here. And the spiritual teacher says, no, now you go back down into the world and see if you can keep that up. And of course, he goes back to Paris. He gets into a fight. He gets drunk. He like gets robbed. You know, like all these things happen to him. You know, because when he was up in the hut, it was easy because he didn't have to deal with anybody. You know, he didn't have to deal with anything. But then when he came back into the world, all of his same things and triggers and everything were still there. And so that's a really interesting thing. And I think that's what Gerald May is kind of grappling with in this book. When he goes off into the wilderness by himself, he has all of these, you know, all of these things are teaching him, whether it's animals or the breeze or the cold or the water. And he doesn't have a lot of other people to deal with. But the hard part is to take these lessons and to bring them back into our lives when you live in a home with 200 other people, or when you're at Times Square and there's a naked cowboy dancing in front of you, or, you know, like, you know, when you're in, which I've seen actually, you know, but when you're out in the world and all these things are coming at you, can we keep that quiet and that silence that we do find in prayer and meditation, in times of artwork, doing artwork, right? That's the tough part. So I think that's what Gerald May is kind of grappling with, and seeing if before he dies, he can have, you know, these moments when he's not just in the wilderness, but he's back kind of with his family as well and stuff like that. This next section is called Animal Being. Now, a dozen years later, the dream of the mountain lion remains fresh and clear in my mind. I wrote it in my journal, but there really was no need to. It is imprinted in my consciousness, and it continues to teach me. At first, I thought the teaching was about animal being, the mystery of what goes on inside the consciousness of wild creatures. Now, however, I believe the teaching of my dream and the teaching that all wild things continually offer us is really about ourselves, about human nature. I will never understand the inner life of a mountain lion, nor of any other animal. But I am sure that wild creatures share this one characteristic. They are completely and totally themselves. They do not pretend to be anything else. They do not question their identity. They do not second guess themselves. They are what they are, and they are impeccable at it. They have no use for questions about their worth on earth. They are worthy. Once I saw a stag in Rock Creek Park in the heart of the District of Columbia. I know exactly what that is. An animal used to seeing people and allowing them to see him. He was slightly streetwise, but wild enough, untamed. He nipped at branches and nibbled at grass, but frequently he stopped and stood very still for a long time. In these extended stillnesses, he was smelling the air, listening to the sounds, looking, seeing all around. I sensed his feeling the ground beneath his hooves, feeling the sensations inside his strong, good body. He was impeccable. The stag communicated a very dynamic, lively being who one is where one is. This is possible for us as well, if we can find our natural living wilds that actively feels itself and sniffs the air, sees everything clearly, and listens with alert ears. Do not think that deer or human beings who have learned the lesson become vigilant only to detect danger. The alertness is also to detect goodness, food, companionship, soft places, water, sunlight, shade, and sky. And more than that, it is to be appreciative, alive, and responsive to where you are and what you will do next. The alertness goes inside as well as outside. It senses the quality of your heartbeat, the depth of your breath, the warmth of your hide, the comfort of tightness of your guts. It is feeling all your being and the completeness of your situation. I think that's a good lesson too. A lot of people say that when they're extremely frightened or angry or whatever, that they become very present. But I like what he's saying here is that it shouldn't just to be detect danger. We should also detect the goodness of life. Like all these beautiful things that are constantly around us all the time. The more still we become, the more we feel them. To do this well, the deer teaches you must take many times to stand very still in the midst of whatever you are doing. Whether you are grazing or walking, running through the forest, or drinking from a stream, you must stop and become very attentive. Lift your head, look and see what is around you, perk your ears, listen and hear, sniff the air, feel your body, move only that which helps you sense, shake your head a little, paw the ground a bit, take one breath that is deeper than most. Turn your head to look here or there, lick your tongue to taste your face. The stillness inside must become exquisite. It must deepen into a moment of absolutely pure and utterly simple wakefulness in which your whole being is vitally present. In this stillness, you exist in beauty, and your next movement is perfectly clear. It is the practical, immediate ground of both appreciation and wisdom. Now, when I walk in the wood fields, I like to stop, sometimes suddenly, sometimes softly. I stand like a tree. I look around and feel my body. I notice my breath steaming in the cool air. I sense inside my emotions and heart perceptions. My listening is sharp and my seeing acute. I feel the temperature, the sun or the snowflakes, and what thoughts or images may come to the surface of my mind. If I want to know which way to turn next, I wait, see, listen. My being lives and wisdom comes. Any thoughts on that? Last couple paragraphs there talking about how to come into contact with this deeper part of yourself.
None in this room, I think.
How often throughout the day do you take, if you're doing something, just take a moment to just stand there and absorb everything around you?
Years ago, well, first of all, I have deaf, and I had a new hearing years ago, and walking in a retreat, kind of a wilderness farm area, and love to hear the birds, especially when they take off from the ground. So I kind of approached them quietly, step by step, what this guy had written, to feel the emotion, listen to the sound, just being present and just look around, but really watching this bird. And he was sitting on the ground, or she was sitting on the ground, but, as I walked slowly toward it, and he's still sitting, and finally it took off, but it flapped. I never ever heard a bird take off flapping his wings, or her wings. Never heard that sound. I was just like, ah. And then I came out of the wilderness toward the building, and the woman would ask me what you're doing. I said, I'm listening to the birds, I'm listening to nature. She looked at me and shook her head and walked off. Oh, that's so sad. Really, I mean, you hear what the nature is saying to you, or telling you. But at least for me, seeing what in their world is like, or what they're doing. So,
How many years ago was that?
Maybe 10, 15 years ago, but it still stay in my mind. It's like hearing a hummingbird hums, and I was just standing still. I never heard it before, and I was just like, ah. And I was just so every time I walk in nature, I just try to, if I'm by myself, I just try to hear what nature has to say. You get a lot of information, a lot.
Yeah, it's amazing that if maybe even 15 years ago, that sound you can still hear in your mind's eye.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
I was raised in Rockville, Maryland, and I know Rock Creek Park, the district of Columbia, very well.
That's cool that you know one of the areas he's talking about. Yeah.
I think it's hard to do that, to stop and listen, and we're kind of conditioned or trained, or I don't know, you got to be busy, you got to be doing something. You're only productive when you're doing something. So if you're not doing something, you're lazy, or so you feel that to sit and just listen.
Yeah, that's very true, and especially kids in school. Both my wife and I, teach, and one of the things I used to work with a lot of at-risk youth. Every summer, I would work for a different program for at-risk youth. A lot of them were kids that were in gangs from Detroit or Washington D.C. or Seattle, and we would always work with them out in the wilderness. A lot of them were wilderness camps, and the hardest thing for them to get used to is when they come out there, they'd carry a radio around with them all the time, just to have noise, because they're like, it's too quiet here. We need to have noise. So they would constantly be carrying radio, sometimes big radios, sometimes Walkmans, but they would constantly have noise on. And so, my goal I was a writing instructor and kind of was teaching them meditation and contemplative techniques, was to get them just to kind of listen to the nature, to try to listen to the nature. And so I remember one time, this one kid who constantly carried around this big radio with him, so that you always knew he was coming from like a mile away, because you're out in the middle of Wyoming and all you could hear was this radio. But anytime I saw him under a tree one time, and he had his big radio next to him, but it wasn't on. And I asked him, I said, well, what made you turn the radio off? He's like, I just realized that I was just overwhelmed with noise all the time. And he's like, I don't think I could understand that until I got out here, because when I'm at home, I turn my radio up because my neighbor has their radio on real loud. And then our other next door neighbor turns their radio on even louder, and then somebody's blasting the TV down the hall. And he's like, all we're ever doing is outdoing each other with our own noise. And he's like, I realized that I was bringing my radio everywhere and there was, nobody to outblast. And he's like, so I just turned it down, and then I eventually turned it off. And he's like, I think it's the first time I've ever just sat in silence in my whole life. He was 17 years old. And it was interesting because he was there for a month. It was like different age groups for a month. And before he left, I asked him, I said, well, what do you think is going to happen now that you're going back to, Washington, D.C., to live back in the projects where you live, where everybody's outdoing each other with noise? He goes, I really hope that I can find one place like where I can sit quietly. He goes, but to be honest with you, I highly doubt it. He goes, because there's just so much noise where I live, and people just want more and more noise, that he goes, I'll be hard pressed to find some place that's just quiet to sit. And that really struck me. And that was about 10 years ago that I worked in that camp with that group of kids, it really struck me that he felt that he probably wouldn't be able to find one place to sit and be quiet with himself. Because, that's tough. I mean, like, that's a really harsh reality, to just be constantly bombarded by noise one's whole life. So moments of silence.
We had kids stay with her. They'd come up from, well, I lived up in the Philly Lakes area, how it can be quiet there. And they stayed with us. It was, I think, a crew team from Jersey or maybe New York City area. And that was the one thing that kind of disturbed them. It's too quiet here. There's no noise. And yet these were kids that had been out on water and rowing and stuff, but there was no background noise, except maybe the crickets and stuff. And that was scary to them.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It was scary to them, right? Because that's true. It is a fear. It's fear. My dad was a cop in a very urban environment his whole life, and so I was working at a farm up in Maine one summer, and I had reserved a room for him at the bed and breakfast, which was on the water, for him to stay at for a couple of days, so I could show him around this place that I had been working for 3 months and that I really loved. And he came up. He stayed in the room one night, and the next morning he left. And he went back to New Jersey. He didn't even see me. He just said he's used to sirens and all this stuff, and he just couldn't handle the quiet. He'd been a cop for 25 years, in a really harsh environment that would scare the hell out of most people. But he was scared out of being in a farm type environment in Maine. That's what scared him. So it is fear. It's a fear of the unknown a lot of times. If you get kind of comfortable with what you know, and if you're filled with noise all the time, then quiet would be quite scary to somebody who's used to being saturated in noise. So it's a really interesting thing. All right, let's continue. So I'll reiterate this. At the time I wrote those words, we're at the bottom of 168. I wanted to be like the stag. And for a long time after my dream, I wanted to be exactly like the mountain lion. Present, clear, free, and dead sure. But in the dream, when he turned and chased me, and I ran fast and straight, and when I leaped upon the packing crates without a thought and without missing a step, I was not being a mountain lion. I was being me, fully, immediately, wildly me. The poet Rilke said, "Everything in nature grows and defends itself in its own way, and is characteristically and spontaneously itself, seeking at all costs to be so against all opposition." The attack of the mountain lion made me completely myself within the dream, and I have been more fully myself ever since. This, I am convinced, is the real teaching of wild creatures. By so fully being who they are, they show us how to be who we really are. This is the great lesson of the wisdom of the wild. Healing. As I have said many times, nature's teaching is also a healing. And although we must indeed be taught, it is the healing that we need most. We have been fractured. We have been broken off from the nature of our world, broken away from the nature of one another, broken apart from our own nature. The pain of this breach is so constant that we have become accustomed to it, and it feels normal. The pain is with us every day when we browbeat ourselves for not handling things right, when we judge ourselves and others, when we struggle for control, when we draw circles around ourselves that shut others out, when we long for a connectedness that we cannot find, when we try to help one another and it's never enough, and perhaps most of all, when we go outdoors and feel that nature is something different from us. You and I and every other human being on earth are part of nature. Like it or not, our buildings, roads, billboards, and junkyards are part of nature. The smoke from our factories and the waste from our refineries are part of nature. And all the things we do to try to protect the environment and save endangered species, these too are part of nature. But no matter how kindly we feel, we will never be able to participate in healing the world around us as long as we keep seeing nature as something different from ourselves. Some of us still see the earth as an enemy, something to conquer, subjugate, and squander. More of us, thank God, now see it as something to cherish and to care for. But even in our cherishing, the earth remains an it, a something, an object that is not us. The popular language is stewardship of the environment. Stewards are managers, overseers, caretakers, and no matter how benevolent they are, they must forever remain apart from that which they care for. We do not know who we really are in this world, and like zeal-blinded missionaries trying to help what they consider to be a primitive tribe, our well-meaning hands become abusive. Before we can effectively heal the wounds we have inflicted upon the rest of nature, we must allow ourselves to be healed, and we must allow the rest of nature to help us. I do not know exactly how the healing happens. I only know a little bit of what has happened to me. I am sure you also have had some experiences of it. It can happen in very ordinary situations, like feeling your hands in the dirt of a garden or lying on your back in a field. In part, it happens just through the physical touch of earth and sky and growing things. This physical healing touch has to go deep within us to where we are truly broken. For me, the deep touching happens when my mind stops and my senses open and I am given willingness. I have never been able to do this for myself. It has to come through grace in the presence of the one I called the power of the slowing, the wisdom of the wild. This power, this spirit, comes as it will and moves wherever it wants in ways we can neither project nor control. And that is a kind of a summation of the Bible verse, John 3:8. It may call you to places very different from those I have spoken of, or come to you with another name. It may appear as she or he or it, or perhaps the presence will drift like mists and emptiness beneath your senses, and you won't notice a thing, except that you've become more open in the moment, more desirous, more here and now, and more freely, fully, naturally yourself. It's so interesting how much our senses help connect us to nature. And for the past week, I haven't been able to taste or smell anything. And it really, somebody today was asking me, like, what is that like, because of COVID? And it's a very weird thing to have food in front of you that you cannot taste and you cannot smell. And that when you eat it, it doesn't taste like anything, because so much of our eating is not only the tasting, but also the smelling. So I have to rely totally on sight now, which is very interesting, just to rely on sight for your food to kind of make you even hungry. But it's a very different thing. I've never experienced that before, where I couldn't taste or smell anything, and I hope it passes. But it's been a very interesting experiment trying to eat. And I've lost like 7 pounds because I just don't feel the desire to eat because I can't taste anything, I can't smell anything. So when you cut off your senses, some of your senses, like it cuts you off from part of your nature that you have to connect with the outer world. So I hope none of you ever lose your taste or your smell. All right, this is the last chapter, chapter 11. And we'll, let's see, yeah, we have enough time and we can just start it. It's called Another Wilderness. And the quote from St. John of the Cross is, Who has the power to heal me? Now wholly surrender yourself. Do not send me any more messengers. They cannot tell me what I must hear. And I love those quotes. They're really good. So here we go, returning to daily life, kind of what we were talking about before. Every time I returned to my daily life from those early trips to the mountain, I found myself pained by the loss of something dear. I desperately wanted to find a way to bring the power of slowing home with me from the wilderness. I prayed to experience her presence and guidance in my busy, civilized life, as well as in wilderness solitude, but it did not happen. No matter how hard I prayed or how diligently I tried to be open and welcoming at home and at work, she never showed up there. Old habits die hard, and I found myself trying to cope with the grief of this loss. I first tried to arrange my life so I could spend more time alone in the wilderness. I looked into buying some mountain land of my own and even went so far as to place a bid on a piece of property close to the state forest. I didn't feel completely right about buying wilderness, though. It seemed too manipulative, too controlling, and I found myself relieved when the deal finally fell through. Then I got permission from the owners to camp in the precious place of fields and meadows where the giant matriarch tree lives, where I saw the little deer that was completely fear, where I found the turtle shell, and where I had so carefully measured the movements of the sun through the seasons. I built a lean-to and a fire pit there and spent many lovely hours at that place. But for some reason, it never worked out for me to camp there overnight. I also went for more frequent day trips in my canoe. They were sweet and refreshing, but with all these attempts, I never again felt the power of the slowing come into me and guide me with the strength she had in the mountain forest. By the summer of 1994, even the mountain itself felt different. I drove to Green Ridge in June and, to my shameful resentment, found that many other people had discovered its joys. Only a few years earlier, almost no one had camped there in summertime, but now the place seemed crowded and I had to search for a site that promised even a little solitude. I finally found one, but on the second day, a Boy Scout troop pulled in and set up camp a quarter of a mile down the hill. I was honestly happy that others were sharing this place, but I could not avoid a small proprietary anger. It was my place, and I wanted to keep it for myself. And there too, even before the scouts came, the power of the slowing failed to appear. Intellectually, I understood, and I still understand today, that the power of the slowing will always be completely wild and free. She shows up when and where and how she chooses, according to the divine wisdom that she is. It was never my place to determine her actions, only to respond to her invitations. I also understood that in reality, she is everywhere always, but that was no consolation, for I no longer could sense her palpable presence, the feel of her guiding my steps. I missed her terribly, but there was nothing I could do. Very gradually, I began to notice something I had been previously unwilling to admit. I no longer heard the call of the wilderness. My yearning to be alone out there had disappeared. The time of the power of the slowing had ended. I'm going to stop there because that's for me a natural kind of one of the last natural breaking points for the rest of the book. So we'll finish the rest of this book next week. We have a little extra time next week, so I'm going to read you also another essay that I wrote after that we finish the book next week. So we stopped at page 175, and we'll pick up next week where it says very gradually. But what he's talking about too is something I think that everybody goes through. when you go on a trip, when you are in a place for, like, I used to lifeguard every summer on the New Jersey shore. And at the end of the summer, there was always this kind of, everybody starts to go back to school, people go back to their homes. And there's always like a couple of days that we would stay past Labor Day, because I didn't have to go to college until like September 15th. And there was always a few guards who started at colleges later, and we would always hang out, and the beaches would be empty, and all of our friends would have gone home. And it was kind of like saying goodbye to our place. But it always had to come to an end. We always had to go back to school. People had to go back to their lives. But there was always a little bit of a, another summer had come to a close, and you had to leave this place that you loved so much, which I really did love Long Beach Island, New Jersey. You had to leave this place and go to this other place. And there was always a kind of sorrow about it, but you knew that it had to happen. And I think that's kind of this feeling I'm getting out of him. He had all these beautiful years that he went to this place, but then it changed. And he changed. And the last part of the book is kind of letting go of that and understanding why it happens. So it'll be an interesting finish next week. So it's good to see you this week after not being able to see you last week. I hope you have a blessed week, and we'll finish this up next week. And then like I said, I'll also, because we'll have a little extra time once this is done, I'll read you an essay from one of my books about nature. So
Where are you now?
where am I? So my wife, because she got COVID when her school was ending, she never got to say goodbye to any of the teachers or to clear out her classroom. And today was the only day that they would let her do that. So I am in her classroom in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is about an hour from where we live, because she has to clean out her place today and say goodbye to everybody.
Okay.
You're on
I'll
the
be
east
home
side.
next week.
Okay, well, have a great week, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
Take care, everyone. Good seeing you all.
Hope you're better, getting better.
Yeah. I want to get my taste back.